Hello and welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. Today, or this week rather, we're talking about two topics. So one of those topics is introspective awareness. So we're going to be looking at the way in which people have knowledge of their own mental states. Of course, this is a topic that we've touched on before, but we're going to be developing it some more this week. And then in addition to that, we're going to be talking about the nature of cognitive dissonance. So this is a kind of psychological self-defense mechanism that our minds have, where we sort of deal with instances in which we have contradictory cognitive states or contradictory beliefs. So that'll be the other video that'll be coming down tomorrow. This one is looking at the way in which we have self-knowledge. So of course, this obviously builds on something we've talked about before. We discussed the same topic back when we talked about Ryle and Carruthers. And when we were talking about their view, we contrasted it with a kind of view of introspective awareness. This idea that we have a separate kind of special mental process for knowing about our own mental states. That's different from how we know about the mental states of others. Many of you, in fact, wrote your papers on this. I've just been finishing up grading those this weekend. Still have a few more to go, but I'm getting there. I think that this topic is going to relate to that discussion. This topic, though, however, is going to look at, or today's discussion is going to look at sort of empirical evidence for the claim that we lack introspective awareness that is privileged in any way about our own mental states. Okay, let's turn to the discussion. So this article is supported by the Nisbett and Wilson, or this presentation is supported by the Nisbett and Wilson article, which I hope you'll be taking a look at. That's a really long theoretical article, and I've cut out some kind of aspects of it that I want you to focus on. But this article, like Ryle's philosophical piece from The Concept of Mind, and Carruthers' preview or précis for the opacity of mind, this article sort of is taking the same kind of angle there, and that's against the privileged access view. So let's just remind ourselves then what the privileged access view is. Well, according to the privileged access view of self-knowledge, we have special access to our own mental states and processes. Indeed, in addition to this, we can reliably indicate our own reasons for acting or decision-making process. So the idea is that, I can direct my mental state towards my own mental states and processes and indicate what those states are. I have a capacity to reliably indicate the reasons or processes that I used in acting or making decisions. And then, what these two boil down to is basically Cartesian introspective awareness, which we've talked about before. By the way, I've been noticing that people link together Cartesianism as though it's a complete view. But I think now, these various kinds of aspects of Cartesianism that we've talked about, like the kind of Cartesian belief formation process that Gilbert discusses, or the actual Cartesian dualism, or this aspect of Cartesian introspective awareness, which Ryle has criticized previously, those are sort of all optional approaches that a theorist might take these days. It sort of is useful for us to talk about them as Cartesian because he takes a certain viewpoint that is very prevalent and useful to just like pick out to talk about what these concepts are. But you can be a Cartesian in one of these fields and not the other. So I just want to suggest that you talk about each of these separately and not someone is embracing necessarily all three if they embrace one of them. Okay, so Cartesian introspective awareness is this basic idea that we have special access to our own mental states and processes, and indeed that we can reliably indicate our own reasons for acting or decision-making processes. And so this is going to be what the article that you look at by Nisbett and Wilson calls into question, this concept of a kind of privileged access to our own mental states. So I think we might pause again to consider how ingrained this belief is. I know we've thought about this before, but we might ask, why did you decide to see His House, a currently trending horror film on Netflix? And if you've seen it, maybe you would give reasons as to why you were led to watch that movie. We could ask, why did you break up with them, with some person that you've recently broken up with? And probably you'll give reasons for why that happened, why you broke up with them. We might ask, why did you vote for Biden? Maybe you'll give like specific reasons related to policy or whatever about why you voted for Biden. But in each of these cases, we think that we're able to give these reasons because we have a kind of awareness to what our mental states are. We're able to reliably know how we ended up going through this process, and we're able to report that. And so I think this feeds into this specific components of what this view embraces. So this view says, that we have direct access to our higher order mental processes. So we're not thinking here about sort of base level processes of perception, like this isn't like controverting informational encapsulation for edge detection or something like that. But what it's saying is that we do have direct access to our higher order mental processes, right? Our decision-making processes, the stuff we might think of as system 2, right? So according to this privileged access view, we have direct access to those system 2 mental processes, such as those involved in evaluation, judgment, problem solving, and the initiation of behavior, deciding what to do. And also according to this view, when we're asked to report why events led us to behave in a certain way, then all we do is simply consult our memories of the situation and the mediating process to supply an explanation. So the idea is that that information is available to us in our working memory, and we can just look and see how we made a decision and report on how we made that decision. Working memory, episodic memory, in some way it's stored as to how we went across that process of deciding to break up with this person or deciding to vote for Joe Biden. And we just recall that and tell how we did it. That's another component of how we have privileged access to our own mental states. And then the third idea is that this kind of access is privileged and therefore more likely to be true. So I, have this direct access. If I say this is how things are, I'm have sort of a prime of place in deciding how I actually made that decision, more so than you. You're not in a better position to judge my mental states and processes. I'm not in a better position to judge yours. This is all part of the privileged access view. Okay, so Nisbett and Wilson in this paper from 1977 that you looked at are challenging this same view. So they're challenging every component of this view, of privileged access. So what do they say? Well, they say, first of all, that we may have no direct access to higher order mental processes, such as those involved in evaluation, judgment, problem solving, and the initiation of behavior. They say that when people are asked to report how a particular stimulus influenced a particular response, they do so not by consulting the memory, right? Remember the last few said we can just remember how we made that process and state it therefore. They say they do so not by consulting the memory of the mediating process, but by applying or generating causal theories about the effects of that type of stimulus on that type of response. And then finally, they say that people's reports about their higher mental processes should be neither more nor less accurate in general than the predictions about such processes made by observers. So they're saying, no, we're not in a kind of privileged position in deciding why we actually acted. So each of these components contravene or go against what was said here, that says we have direct access to our higher order mental processes, such as those involved in evaluation, judgment, problem solving, and the initiation of behavior. They want to say we have no direct access, or we may have no direct access to those higher mental processes. The privileged access view says when we're asked to report why events led us to behave in a certain way, we consult our memories. They say no. When people are asked to report how a particular stimulus influenced a response, they do so by applying a general causal theory about the effect of that type of stimulus on that type of response. So it has nothing to do with looking inside. It has to do with our kind of theoretical beliefs. And then finally, they say that this, the privileged access view says this access is privileged and therefore more likely to be true. And they say no. Other people may know about our mental states just as well as we do. Okay, So what I'm going to do now is just do some cherry-picked examples. This paper is very rich. I had you read only a portion of it, but there's a lot of information, and I'm just going to do one cherry-picked example for each of these points. If you have the time, I really encourage you to read this groundbreaking paper. It's one of the most important, papers written in the last 50 years in psychology. It's worth a read, but we're just going to look very quickly at some of the information or some of the evidence that they use to argue for their positions, which go against the privileged access view. So here's the first point. This is their evidence in favor of the view that we may have no direct access to higher order mental processes, such as those involved in evaluation, judgment, problem solving, and the initiation of behavior. So there's a variety of different studies that they talk about here, and they serve to illustrate this point in various ways. The first one I'm going to talk about is one, the busing study, essentially. And so the way this study works is essentially what they're saying is, okay, if I'm going to be aware of the process that led me to change my mind, then I clearly have to be aware that I changed my mind, okay? If I'm unaware that I actually changed my mind, then I can't be aware of a process that led me to change my mind. So this study is meant to show that oftentimes when we do change our minds, we're just unaware of that. So we can't be aware of a process that led us to make that decision. And this will go to that view that we don't have privileged access to these kinds of internal processes of reflection that make us change our mind. Okay, so here's what Nisbett and Wilson say. They say, so those subjects may sometimes report of the existence of a new evaluation, right? So if they're asked a question, they may evaluate it one way and then evaluate it another way sometime later. So those subjects may sometimes report a new evaluation. They may still be unaware that the evaluation has changed. So even though they may change what their opinion is on something, they may not know that it has changed. And if so, right, then they cannot be aware of the nature of the cognitive process that has occurred, because they are not even aware of the fact that a process has occurred at all, right? So this is the point I was just making. So now let's look at how this study works. So this is a study that they're relying on. They cite lots of research here, but this study is due to Goethals and Reckman from 1973. And in this study, the authors assessed the attitudes of high school students on 30 social issues. So this is during a period of desegregation in the United States, when in many areas of the country, we were moving to desegregate the public schools, which had been segregated on the basis of race up to that point. What they did was they asked people about all these questions, these social issues. Busing is going to be very important here. So they asked them in this one interview, and then 1 to 2 weeks later, they called them back for a follow-up. So they do these kinds of surveys of attitudes of these high school students in groups composed of 3 busing or 3 anti-busing students, right? So they knew that these students' views in advance. They selected them on the basis of this. And then to each of these groups, so they have the 3 pro-busing students or the 3 anti-busing students. And to each of these groups, they added 1 plant. And so the plant was like, a young college student that Goethals and Reckman were working with, that they had pretend to be either pro busing in the anti-busing group or anti-busing in the pro-busing group, okay? So he's just there to vociferously argue the opposite side. Think of it this way. He has all the materials, all the arguments built up. He's like the best debate club nerd ever, and he knows all the issues that he's going to put forward to argue for a particular position, right? So he's there to argue the opposite of whoever's there with him. And so now what happens is, right, so what they do is they have these people show up, give their opinions, have this kind of discussion. Then 2 weeks later, they're called back. And again, they indicate their opinion about busing. So all the people that were there that had been anti-busing to begin with, when they first showed up, they marked themselves as anti-busing. But it turns out that this confederate of the experimenters had been incredibly successful. This guy had all the arguments, And he was able to convince everyone in his group, and they all ended up changing their position. So when they're called back in 2 weeks, the original anti-busing students had their opinions sharply moderated in pro direction. Like those who were like really terribly in favor or against busing went like less against busing. And then those who were like sort of less against busing went all the way over to pro busing afterwards. And then most of the pro busing subjects were actually converted to an anti-busing position, right? So this Confederate was really successful. And so now these people are expressing this totally new opinion about busing. So what happens, right? What do? We ask them, right? Well, I mean, first of all, I should tell you, there was this control group, right, who wasn't subject to this. And so they were asked to recall what their previous position was. They know what their previous position was. They report it accurately. And then when they're asked what their position is now, they report that as being the same, right? So these control participants who had not debated with this guy recalled their initial positions perfectly, right? And these were the same as their current position. But the participants who had been in the experimental conditions recalled their positions, their initial positions, in such a way that they conformed to their current positions, right? And in fact, you know, because they conformed to their current position, they were in fact quite different from what their original positions had actually been. So what we find is that these participants were unable to recall what their previous mental state had been. And if they're unable to recall that, then clearly they don't know that they've gone through a process of belief change, you know, from moving from anti-busing to now being pro-busing. And if they don't know that they're moving from that position, then certainly they don't know what the underlying process is, right? So we must lack this kind of direct access to our mental states. Do we really lack introspective awareness of our own cognitive states and processes? Well, I think this is a question you should be asking in light of some of these studies that Nisbett and Wilson discuss. And let's turn now to the second point of their specific claim. Right, so first of all, they said, right, that we may have no direct access to higher order mental processes, such as those involved in evaluation, judgment, problem solving, and the initiation of behavior. So in this case, we're not aware in the busing study that we changed our evaluation. So we don't know the process that leads to evaluation is the claim. Now here's the second point. We're going to look at some evidence for this too. When people are asked to report how a particular stimulus influenced a particular response, they do so not by consulting a memory of the mediating process, but by applying or generating causal theories about the effects of that type of stimulus on that type of response. Okay, so what's this saying? Well, what this is saying is, right, that when people do report how something affected their decision or why they went through a process of deciding how the process of deciding worked, they don't do this by consulting the memory, right? Remember, the traditional privileged access view said we know what our mental processes are because we remember how we made the decision. What Nisbett and Wilson want to say is no, we don't do this by consulting a memory of the mediating process, right? We don't like think back to how we made the decision, but instead we place kind of general causal theory, right? This kind of general psychological theory that we might have about the effects of a particular type of stimulus on a particular type of response. So Nisbett and Wilson also want to argue that we come to these decisions using general causal theories. Okay, and the study that they discussed, one of the studies they discuss here, I think is really interesting. What it is it's a kind of study of insomniacs. And so what they did was they took this kind of initial measure of time to bed to time to sleep for insomniacs. So they had the insomniacs record when they went to bed, and then the next morning estimate when they fell asleep. Okay, so you get a kind of sense of how long they were up. I mean, people are okay at this. So, you know, people who are insomniacs remember being up for much longer than people who are not, okay? So then what they told people to do is they had this kind of history of how they, you know, how their insomniac behavior manifested itself. And then they put these people into two conditions, and they told them to take a pill 15 minutes before bed. So those in the arousal condition were told that the pill produces rapid heart rate and alertness, okay? So they said, look, as part of the study, we're first going to have you take this pill. It's going to increase your heart rate and your alertness, but we need you to do this. There were also people in a relaxation condition, and they were told that the pill they were being given, they were said, as part of the study, we need you to take this pill. What it's going to do is it's going to reduce your heart rate and decrease your alertness. So that's what they did. And then there was actually a control group as well, I think. Okay, so they give these people these pills, and what do they find? They incredibly find that the people who were given the pill in the arousal condition, that were told that the pill they were given would produce rapid heart rate and alertness, recorded a quicker sleep time than the people in the relaxation condition who stayed up later. Okay, so incredibly, this pill, again, I might not have mentioned this before, but the pill is a placebo, as it's clearly labeled there, right? So it's a sugar pill. It doesn't actually do anything. But the people who are told this story, that the pill will produce rapid heart rate and alertness, actually fall asleep quicker than the people who were told they would reduce their heart rate and decrease their alertness, which are things associated with sleep. So the question is, well, what's actually going on? We know there's not a drug in this pill that's actually affecting their sleepiness. But, this sort of story about what's going on here is not what we would typically expect. We don't expect people to fall asleep if they're being worried about their heart rate or whatever. So what's actually going on? Well, the thought is that this sugar pill actually gives the insomniacs in the condition, the arousal condition, a scapegoat. So those in arousal will go to sleep more quickly since they now have a target of their arousal symptoms, right? So they're thinking, well, it's actually this pill that's causing the effects of me. It's not anything to do with my life or whatever. So they don't worry about their life as much and they just fall asleep, right? Those in relaxation, on the other hand, will take longer to go to sleep. They think, oh God, I've taken this pill that should help me go to sleep. And I'm so messed up. My life is so messed up that I'm still laying here with my insomniac symptoms. Right? So that's actually what's going on. The pill gives this kind of cover. And this is what the experimenters predicted in advance. That's what they actually find. They actually do find that the people who are told they're in the arousal condition go to sleep quicker. Okay, so how do we explain what's happening here? So that's the explanation. That's actually clearly what's going on in this case. That explains the effect. But then how do people explain what happened to them? So think about the insomniacs. They're interviewed after this and they're asked why. So they're told, like, you were in this condition and you were told that this pill is going to make you more aroused, but you fell asleep more quickly than the people who were told that it was going to relax them. Okay. So that was pointed out to the subjects both in the arousal condition and in the relaxation condition. And what do they say in response? Well, both groups in this case confabulated, that means made up, other explanations for the results, right? So those who were in the arousal condition, or those who were in the relaxation condition might have said, well, I had specific stresses at work, right? So, it's not that like my thinking about being relaxed and then getting freaked out about my life caused this. It's just other things kept me awake. The pill didn't have anything to do with it. Or someone might say that they have a tendency to fall asleep later during the week, right? So people just confabulated and made up other stories, even though it's clear that this kind of experimental condition is what's explaining what happened, right? None of these participants reported having thought about the pill in the least when falling asleep. And all rejected the scientist's explanation that it was due to this kind of cover story as absurd, okay? So what happens here? We know that the cover story is making all the difference. Like that's the effect that has been carefully controlled and it produces this result. But people reject that, right? So clearly they must lack this kind of internal awareness of what actually makes them make the decision. And instead, what they must be relying on is some theory, a theory which says, no, like a stupid story someone tells you about a pill isn't going to keep you awake. It's something else in your life. Okay. Essentially what Nisbett and Wilson want to suggest is that people are using a variety of what's called the representativeness heuristic in this case, right? So the representativeness heuristic is something we touched on a long time ago at the beginning of the term. It's from a paper by Tversky and Kahneman, and we read a little bit of Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The representative heuristic asks us, or is something that relates to our judgment of how likely someone falls into a certain category, right? So consider this following question. How likely is it that Bob is a librarian? And then what about Hank? So consider these two. So you're supposed to consider which is more likely to be a librarian. Now, Bob is quite bookish, not quiet, bookish, and not particularly fit. Hank is boisterous outdoorsman, right? Well, the idea is that information here that is more pertinent is ignored in favor of a stereotype, right? So I might have put something in here about Hank having gone to UNC, which has a great librarian school, right? But we probably would have ignored that and used sort of the stereotype about librarians as being quiet, bookish, and maybe not fit to make a assessment that Bob is more likely to be the librarian out of these two. So we clearly rely upon stereotypical or representative information in deciding whether something falls into a certain category. So this bears into this theory, right? This theory about how we make assessments about what caused our mental state in the following way. The basic idea is that a particular stimulus or input will be identified as a likely cause to the extent that it fits a particular stereotype, right? So just as I might be likely to judge that someone is a librarian because they fit my stereotype of a librarian, I would be likely to judge that some phenomena fits a cause because it falls into the stereotype that I have of causes for this particular category, right? For example, the particular category of causing me to stay up late at night, right? So this is the basic idea that they're suggesting, right? And we might think of these kinds of stereotypes as being filled out about our kind of folk theories about mental states, or even our psychologically scientific theories about mental states. So the idea is that if we have an explicit rule or specific theory that links the two, a particular event to a particular cause, or an implicit theory, a theory that's just like part of, the folk understanding of psychology, or if we presume an empirical covariation of these phenomena, right, they're like correlated but not necessarily causal, all those things might lead us to say that this is the cause. But if a cause doesn't fall into that theory we already embrace, then it's not going to be identified. And again, this redounds to the idea that we don't have a kind of special awareness of what our mental state or our mental processes are, right? We don't actually have that kind of internal privileged access to our own mental states. Instead, we're just applying these kind of ad hoc theories about how minds work, right? And so just to bring this down to the specific ideas discussed in the study, right? Worry about work is a representative reason for insomnia. Thoughts about pills are not, right? And there are other examples of this too that are discussed in the article, right? So one example is the example of the Kitty Genovese case, which you might have heard of. This is referenced obliquely in the article, but in the Kitty Genovese case, this woman was stabbed to death in a housing block in New York. And it's estimated that hundreds of people saw her being stabbed to death below this housing block, and no one called the police. Her attack took place over the course of an hour or more, and the person left and came back. People saw it but did not call. And so why did people not call? Well, the thought is that this is due to a phenomena called the bystander effect. So actually what's going on is when there's diffuse responsibility, when there are a bunch of people that are observing some phenomena, that makes the responsibility for intervening more diffuse. So no one actually ends up intervening in that case. And this is what actually caused it. People actually, though, explain their action in terms of not being able to do anything. So they said, well, I couldn't have stopped it. There's nothing I could have done, right? But we know that actually this is caused by this kind of effect of the bystander effect of number of observers. People are unaware of it. So that's an example of someone, something falling into a kind of representative reason. I can't do anything about it. And the actual phenomena that explains it being reserved or being ignored. Another example of a study that they mention is these studies related to the right-hand bias, which people have. So people are given the option to choose something freely from a table of gifts. We know that people are biased towards the thing on the right. And so oftentimes they'll accept that. Then they're asked why they accept that thing. There's kind of statistically reliable phenomena where they do this, but they'll actually point to factors about the stockings that they happen to choose, right? That they have a kind of fine sheerness to them or something like that, or this really good weave, right? So the point of these factors that we know didn't affect their decision, but are stereotypically thought to be causes of choosing a pair of nylon stockings when given the option to choose various gifts. All right, so another idea here is then, well, if this is the case, then can we get introspection right? Can we actually introspect our judgments? Well, Nisbett and Wilson are kind of skeptical about this. So what they say is that people simply make judgments about how plausible it is that the stimulus would have influenced the response. And they say that these plausibility judgments exist prior to, or at least independently of, any actual contact with a particular stimulus embedded in a particular complex stimulus configuration. Accurate reports, they claim, will occur when influential stimuli are salient and are plausible causes of what responses they produce, and will not occur when stimuli are not salient or not plausible causes. So the basic thought here is that we get it right. We do get it right. We sometimes get right how we made our mental process, but the only time we do that is when actually what led us to make this decision was what fit our stereotype, our causal theory of how this would occur. So it doesn't really vary with any kind of awareness in any sense. So to put it in their words, accurate reports will occur when influential stimuli are salient and plausible causes of the responses they produce, and will not occur when stimuli are not salient or not plausible causes. Right? And I want you to think about how you might challenge this, if at all. Do you think these guys are right, or do you think they've made a mistake? And now let's just look at their last point here, which is that people's reports about their higher mental processes should be neither more nor less accurate in general than the predictions about such processes made by observers. I think we might think of this in terms of what Ryle and Carruthers have said earlier, right? So Ryle and Carruthers pointed out that we figure out our own mental states in the way that we figure out the mental states of others. So if that view is correct, then we should actually not be very accurate, or we shouldn't be accurate about telling what our own mental states are, any more accurate than others are about telling what our mental states are, okay? And so finally, Nisbett and Wilson end by giving some evidence that this is the case, that we are no more accurate than observers. So they give people a portfolio study. They have two groups, reporters and observers, okay? So observers are other people reporting or observing the mental state of the reporters. The reporters are making an assessment of these candidates. So they have 5 stimulus factors that they manipulate. Right, so they're giving a kind of report on a potential hire for a new director of a center. Right, I forget what the details are about the center here, but they're hiring someone for the center director job. Okay, and so they're asked to rank this applicant on 5 factors, and these are manipulated across different participants. They're asked to rank the appearance of the individual, their academic credentials, right? So it's varied, right? Appearance, they'll have different people who do the job. Academic credentials, they'll change details on the person's resume. They'll have a kind of instance in which there's coffee spilled on the resume or not. or they spill their coffee or not. They'll have a story about being in a bad auto accident or not. And then they'll have the opportunity to, so in these previous ones, they're just looking at the image on a photo. They're looking at the academic credentials. They're seeing about whether coffee was spilled on the resume, and they're seeing about whether it's reported the person was in an auto accident. And then they're given the option, in some cases, to meet the applicant, a woman or not. Okay, so they're asked to rank the applicant, they're asked to, these are the factors that are manipulated in reviewing the application, right? So either get to meet the person or not. So then the reporters are asked to make 4 judgments. So they're asked to judge how much they like the woman based on either the survey or the resume, or the resume and actually meeting her, how sympathetic they thought she was or would be, how intelligent they thought she was, and how flexible they thought she would be on the job. And so what we know is, so they were asked to assess, they're asked to make these judgments, and then to ask how each of the 5 stimulus factors, the 5 changes that were made, had influenced each of their judgments, right? So they were asked, for example, whether the fact that she was in an auto accident affected their judgment that she would be sympathetic, or whether her academic credentials affected how intelligent they thought she was, okay? And so observers then, although they weren't asked to make the judgments, they were asked to report how the factors would influence the 4 judgments, okay? So the people who are in the condition are asked how much of these factors actually influence your judgments. The observers are asked how much do you think those factors would influence their judgments. And what they find is that subjects and observer reports of factor influence were so strongly correlated for each of the judgment that it seems highly unlikely that subjects and observers could possibly have arrived at their reports by different means. Subjects were very accurate, for example, in recognizing the effect of academic credentials on intelligence judgments, but they were not accurate at recognizing other effects, right? So it's known that how attractive you judge a person to be will affect how sympathetic you think they are, right? It's known that whether you think someone has undergone a trauma will influence how flexible you think they would be on a job. People didn't notice these things. What people noticed was that credentials affected intelligent judgment. And why did they do that? Well, they did that because that is a kind of phenomena that we have. That's a theory that we have, is that training affects intelligence. But for the other judgments, the accuracy of subject reports was literally nil. So this really suggests that we have no privileged access to our mental states, the way in which we make our decisions. What do you think? Let's talk about it. See you soon. Bye.